Judy's dad, Joe, is a retired sheriff. And when Judy was about 11 years old, Joe took her to visit the Twin Towers Correctional Facility, that men's prison in Los Angeles. Well, Judy was excited to see where her dad worked. But then Joe put Judy in one of those cells, shut the door, and locked it. And he then went on his way to tend a few things before later returning to let her out. Well, Judy didn't like being in prison. Of course, it wasn't a real imprisonment. The cell block was empty, so she didn't get the full effect of living among prisoners, of course, but she got enough to scare her, and she realized this wasn't a fun place to be. Well, in today's story, Paul is under arrest by Roman soldiers, and it wasn't a fun situation for him. On the one hand, there were the Jews in the temple courts who had falsely accused him and tried to beat him to death. But on the other hand, he's being held by the Roman military, the same military that mercilessly mocked and abused Jesus. Paul knows that he's innocent of any crime, but so is Jesus. So he knows this just might not end very well. Before he's taken away into confinement, Paul asks to speak to the crowd. Paul knows that the accusations made against him aren't true, and he wants to set the record straight. But as it turned out, he didn't get very far into his speech before the crowd got all riled up again. And so we see the story in Acts 22, beginning with verse 22. The crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, "Rid the earth of him! He's not fit to live!" As they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. He directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. As they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "This man is a Roman citizen." The commander went to Paul and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes, I am," he answered. Then the commander said, "I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship." "But I was born a citizen," Paul replied. Those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. So Paul had riled up the crowd. He really poked the bear. He was going on just fine, talking about how he loved all things Jewish and how he hated and persecuted Christians. And his Jewish audience enjoyed this part of Paul's speech. Then Paul went on to tell how he met Jesus on the road to Damascus. And he was blinded by the light of Jesus and became a follower of Jesus right then and there. And still, the audience politely listened. Paul then went on to say that a very Jewish man named Ananias came to see him in Damascus. And this man named Ananias, he loved the Jewish law and was highly respected by all the Jews in Damascus. When Ananias said, "Brother Paul, receive your sight," Paul's vision was restored, and Paul was baptized in Damascus. And Paul's Jewish audience still had no issue with what Paul was saying here. Paul then said he returned to Jerusalem. And in the temple, he was in a trance. And God told him to leave Jerusalem and spread the gospel to the Gentiles far away. And when Paul mentioned the Gentiles, there he crossed the line. And his audience immediately turned on him. Well, Paul got into trouble in the first place because some accused him of bringing in a Gentile into the temple. Paul did go to the temple. Paul was there to fulfill his agreement with the church leaders to join in a purification rite with 4 men who had taken a vow. So Paul was completing the requirements of his vow in the temple. It's also true that Paul was seen in the city with Gentiles. After all, he traveled with several Gentiles to Jerusalem to present a love offering to the Jerusalem church from the Gentile churches. But it was not true that Paul had taken a Gentile into the temple. He was in the temple in an attempt to win over the people, not stir them up. The last thing he would do was to bring a Gentile into the temple and make everyone mad. Such an act would have been a serious violation. It would have defiled the temple. But some people really don't need evidence to make an accusation. They saw Paul in the temple. They saw Paul with the Gentiles. So they made a connection. They made the assumption that Paul had brought his Gentile friends into the temple. So when Paul gave his speech, the mere mention of Gentiles was enough to set them off again. And the people expressed their displeasure with Paul. They threw off their cloaks. We're not sure why they did this, but there are some possibilities. One is that ripping their coat off was a gesture of horror at the blasphemy that they perceived Paul was doing. When Paul and Barnabas were in Lystra, the people there thought that they were gods. And Paul and Barnabas were just appalled. It'd be the height of blasphemy. They'd be considered gods. So in Acts 14 and 15, it says, when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you." So Paul and Barnabas tore off their coats as a sign of dismay over the people's blasphemous belief. So now, perhaps the crowd listening to Paul is doing kind of the same thing, expressing their disgust at Paul's perceived blasphemy. Also, throwing their coats off their bodies would make it easier to stone Paul. We know that even on cold days, you don't see Major League Baseball pitchers pitching with a parka on. They need freedom of movement to achieve maximum velocity and effect. So maybe those in the crowd were just getting rid of their jackets so they could get maximum velocity with their stones. We recall that when the Sanhedrin stoned Stephen, they first took off their coats, probably so they could throw better. This happened before Paul became a Christian. It's interesting that when they removed their coats, they gave them to Paul for safekeeping. And perhaps the people shook out their coats as if trying to rid themselves of the contamination of this blasphemy. It'd be like aggressively shaking a beach towel after a day at the beach to get all the sand off of it. So they might be aggressively waving their coats to get rid of Paul's cooties. Or they waved their cloaks wildly into the air to express their collective outrage. Be kind of like at sporting venues that distribute those rally towels during playoff games. That tradition began with the Pittsburgh Steelers and their terrible towels, but now everybody's doing it. And during certain parts of the game, when the crowd tries to make something happen with their team, they'll wave those towels in the air to get their team going. So maybe Paul's audience were doing kind of a rally towel thing with their coats. They were trying to rally the Roman commander to kill Paul. And then they threw dust in the air. Again, we're not really sure what the symbolism of throwing the dust in the air is. They were probably expressing their outrage at Paul's alleged blasphemy. Or maybe they were just throwing dirt at Paul in anger since they didn't have anything more solid to pick up in the temple courts at the moment. And then they called for his death. Rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live. Obviously, emotions were running very high. The people didn't just want Paul's hands slapped. They weren't content with just fining him or throwing him in jail for a while. No, they wanted him dead. Nothing short of that was going to satisfy them. So the Roman commander came to the conclusion that Paul must have done something really wrong to get the people this angry. But the problem is, he didn't have a clue as to what Paul did. He's thinking that Paul had to have done something probably really, really bad to get the people all this worked up. He already saved him once in the temple courts when the crowd was trying to beat him to death, and now they're calling for his death again. So, the commander decided he was going to get to the bottom of this once and for all. He has ways of making people talk. He'll use torture and interrogation. And so he ordered that Paul be flogged in order to get the truth out of him. The kind of flogging that Paul was to receive is the same kind that Jesus received. It was a whipping using a cat of 9 tails, a leather whip in which several lashes were attached to a handle. And inserted into the lashes were rough pieces of bone or metal. And when used as an interrogation technique, it wasn't so much meant to punish as to get at the truth. However, flogging could result in severe damage to the body or even death before the truth could be revealed. It's at this point that Paul decided to play his trump card. He revealed that he was a Roman citizen. A man could either be born a citizen or he could be awarded citizenship for some outstanding service given to the state. Since Paul had been born a Roman citizen, we know that his father had been a citizen also. There are various theories about how Paul's father may have received his citizenship, but the bottom line is nobody really knows for sure. But when Paul revealed that he was a Roman citizen, this changed everything. The centurion who was about to flog Paul was just shocked. He knew that he could be in really big trouble if he flogged a Roman citizen. So he told the commander. And the commander was shocked. This was the last thing he expected to hear from Paul. At this time, it was not common for people in the East to have Roman citizenship, especially if you were not in the upper class. So the commander has to be totally confused. Here's a guy who is a troublemaker and a prisoner, and yet he's a Roman citizen. The commander told Paul that he had to pay a lot of money for his citizenship. Actually, paying for citizenship wasn't the legal way to obtain it. So what he actually did was to pay a bribe to a Roman official. Now, although illegal, obtaining citizenship like this was a fairly common thing during this time. Paul told the commander that he was born a citizen. His name was written on a register in Rome and recorded in the citizenship registry in Tarsus. And as a citizen, he had a right to a Roman trial and was immune from having to suffer severe punishments such as flogging. He was also protected against being executed without a trial, and he had the right to appeal. And there were other rights as well, so a Roman citizenship was really extremely valuable. So not only was Paul a citizen, his citizenship was the real deal. He didn't have to make any backroom deals or pay money under the table. Paul's citizenship was legitimate. His citizenship was of more value than the commander's citizenship? Well, the plan to torture and intimidate Paul were immediately halted. Sometimes having connections can help in sticky situations. Judy has told me that when she was a teenager and got pulled over while driving, she would just casually mention to the officer that her dad is an LA County deputy sheriff. Judy was a name dropper. She had connections. And a couple times when she brought up that little fact, ever so casually, she was let off of her ticket. She was definitely treated differently. So, here Paul shares his connection. And his connection is his Roman citizenship. It's his get out of jail free card. Before he played that card, Paul was treated like a slave or a troublemaker. He was treated like someone who had no rights at all. He was right on the verge of receiving a severe flogging. The command had already been given. Paul was already stretched out and tied to the whipping post. The centurion had his whip ready. But as soon as Paul mentioned his Roman citizenship, everything changed. The whip was immediately put away. Paul was immediately released from the whipping post. And suddenly, the commander and his men were particularly kind to Paul. The commander knew that he had dodged a bullet. He could have been in very hot water had he ended up flogging Paul. It was against the law to even bind a Roman citizen without a trial, and Paul was already bound and almost beaten. What is the takeaway here today? It is that God is in control. The situation with Paul reminds me of Jesus' arrest and his trial and his execution. With Jesus' situation, it looked like the end of Christ's ministry. Judas had betrayed him. The Sanhedrin abused him. Pilate condemned him. The soldiers crucified him. And Joseph buried him. And that was the end of it. Except that it wasn't. All that happened was according to God's plan and in his timing. God was providing a way for fallen mankind to be reconciled with him. With Paul, he found himself in Jerusalem where he was falsely accused, beaten by a mob, taken into custody, and nearly flogged. Paul's friends had warned him not to go to Jerusalem. They told him that things would go sour there, and things did go sour. It looked like Paul's ministry was coming to an end. But it really wasn't. Paul's ministry would continue. He would continue to witness for Christ to people he could never have met had he not been a Roman prisoner. Paul did make it to Rome, and God made it happen, and the Romans paid the bill.